Back in the 1980s, the satanic panic was in full swing and was the number one fear for a lot of people out there. After all, particularly in a large Christian country like the United States, the last thing most folks wanted was for their families to be taken over by the influence of the devil. But while a lot of what actually happened back then may have been overblown, amounting to little more than some kids playing Dungeons and Dragons in their parents' basements, there were examples of real killing being associated with occult-like groups at the time. And one of the most notorious of those groups was based in Chicago, a collection of murderers, mutilators, sexual predators, and cannibals later dubbed by the media as the Chicago Ripper Crew. This is Monsters. Robin Gecht, the man who would eventually go on to become the leader of the Chicago Ripper Crew, was born on November 30th, 1953 in Maynard, Illinois. While growing up, he appeared to be a fairly normal young man on the surface. Sure, there were some who found him to be a little too intense, especially when it came to the glare of his eyes, and there would later be accusations that he'd molested his sister and had been sent to live with his grandparents as a result. But he has continually denied that ever happened, and no concrete evidence has ever been able to prove such an incident occurred. Whatever the truth, it certainly wasn't enough to stop him from meeting and charming the woman who would later become his wife, the very same wife who would go on to give him 3 children come the late 1970s. And so at that point, now with several more mouths to feed, Robin was able to make more money working as a construction subcontractor where he was employed by, of all people, John Wayne Gacy. Of course, there's also no evidence that suggests one of the world's most notorious serial killers revealed any of his secrets to his employee back then, or that Robin told him about any of the dark desires he had already been holding on to for a while. But it is an interesting trivia note regardless and suggests the possibility they were subconsciously drawn to one another. After all, Gacy was known for slowly asphyxiating many of his victims, forcing them to die in a truly painful manner. And while Robin hadn't murdered anyone by then, he was beginning to exhibit signs that there was something amiss, especially when it came to his breast fetish. Now, breast fetishes are nothing unusual in themselves. There's no doubt a large part of the population likely has them. But when it came to the soon-to-be murderer, his love of women's busts went much further than just liking to play with them. No, he liked to injure them, more often than not by stabbing them with pins. That was something he regularly asked his wife to do during sex, and while it wasn't something she necessarily enjoyed, how would she went along with it anyway as she loved her husband. Even when he wanted to allow the wounds he left on her breasts to get infected so that he could play with them, she apparently acquiesced to his demands. As he would later describe it when asked what had created such a fetish within him, quote, "It's a thing with my entire family, from my great-grandfather onward." Wait, so he believes he inherited a desire to inflict damage on breasts? Okay. While those family members may have been happy to limit such things to safe play in the bedroom, Robin was much more ambitious when it came to getting his kicks, as the way he treated his victims would later prove. Before those murders took place, though, the father of 3 would first start taking an interest in the growing fad of satanic worship that was sweeping across the US during the early 80s. Basically, it was something that started during a time when, with conservatism on the rise once more following the election of Ronald Reagan, and parental fears of new board games like Dungeons and Dragons running high on account of its perceived satanic content, there was an increased interest in the occult, both in terms of squashing it before it could take a foothold and in terms of getting involved in it. It was mostly overblown and was given more fuel than it deserved on account of the widespread popularity of books such as Michelle Remembers, a story about a group of murderous Canadian Satanists which caught the attention of many conservative Americans and led them to fear similar groups could be hiding within their very neighborhoods. But that's not to say there was nothing to the phenomenon at all. No, ironically, as a result of the increased focus on Satanism in the media, whether that be via them talking about hidden messages in pop songs or examples of animal mutilation taking place across the country, there were more and more people who learned about something they might not have otherwise. And a small group of those people fell in love with the idea for all the wrong reasons, as they saw it as a way to channel their darker urges. That was certainly the case for Robin Gecht, as at that point he got heavily reinvested in the whole idea of Satanism, something that he had first become aware of during his childhood when he managed to procure a copy of the Satanic Bible. The way he saw it, that belief system aligned with his values, particularly when it came to his sexual fetishes. And it was through that investment that he soon came into contact with 3 men who would go on to become his partners in crime. Those men were Thomas and Andrew Kokoralis, 2 young men from Villa Park, Illinois, who worked for Robin at the construction business he was operating and who, at the time they started taking things to the next level, were still only around 19 and 20 years old. And it wasn't just their age that made them impressionable. There was also the fact they'd later be described in court as simplistic and possessing a borderline range of intellect. Basically, that's a polite way of saying they weren't the brightest kids and that they had a low IQ overall, meaning they were a lot easier to manipulate, mold, and shape the way Robin saw fit. And the same thing could be said about the 3rd young man who'd become a member of the Ripper crew, Edwin Spreitzer, someone who was at about the same level of intelligence as the Kokoralis brothers, though was slightly older than them as he would have been around 21 back then. How did Edwin become involved with Robin Gecht? Well, growing up in Chicago, he'd had a difficult relationship with his stepfather, making home life difficult for him to stomach. On top of that, his low intelligence made him a frequent target for bullies at school, and as a result, he couldn't even find solace there. So when he was kicked out of his family house at around the age of 18, he spent a few years trying to find some kind of place in the world where he could feel like he belonged. And so when he eventually met Robin, and Robin decided to let him come live with him at his own family home, he felt like he'd eventually gotten what he was looking for. But that would prove to be a terrible decision in the long run, as by the time 1981 rolled around, Robin was getting deep into the idea of forming a satanic cult and had already managed to convince his 3 collaborators to get involved too. That was why they began meeting up in his home once his wife left for work, and from there set themselves up in the attic, the place Robin would come to call their satanic chapel. Once inside the satanic chapel, a room that was only lit by candlelight and had a makeshift altar draped in a red cloth with 6 red and black crosses at the back of it, they'd begin their daily rituals. But those rituals wouldn't be contained to this one attic space though, as during their early meetings the leader made it clear they were going to have to find some sacrifices for them to place at the altar if they wanted to appease the devil. Edwin and the Kokoralis brothers went along with it because by then, the 3 young men had taken to believing that Robin actually did have some kind of supernatural powers and that he could use them to control people around him both mentally and physically. So, partially in fear and partially in awe, they pretty much did everything he told them to do as they wanted to be on his side rather than oppose him. Of course, that's not to absolve them of their guilt in what soon took place. They ultimately made the choice to do what they wanted to do, low intellect or not. But it does paint a picture that there was one clear ringleader most responsible for what happened, and that was Robin. Really, it's not that dissimilar to the way other cult leaders such as Charles Manson have been described as being able to cast a spell over their underlings and then from there send them out to do their bidding. In fact, at least one of the young men involved in the Chicago Ripper crew would later use words like spell and trance when it came to describing the effect his leader had on them. They even allegedly felt that if they tried to go against his orders, then he would use them as sacrifices instead. So when he suggested they go out and grab their first victim in May of 1981, they did as told without question. That first victim would end up being Linda Sutton, a 28-year-old single mother from Chicago who was abducted by the 3 young men on May 21st behind the Brer Rabbit Hotel near Wrigley Field, a popular hangout location for local sex workers. That particular profession likely made the crew feel like she'd be a better target to begin with on account of police being less likely to investigate her disappearance. The Chicago Ripper crew took her off the streets and back to an undisclosed location where they eventually proceeded to sexually assault her, kill her, cut off one of her breasts, and then dump her body in a field in Villa Park, not too far from where the Cocorales brothers lived. Afterward, they took the breast to the Satanic chapel in Robin's attic and placed it on the ground in front of them while they knelt at the altar and prayed. As they were doing that, Robin proceeded to read passages from the Satanic Bible, all before then masturbating into the fleshy part of the dissected breast. That wasn't all, because once that was done, he instructed his 3 followers to do the same, something they did without question. Once that was over, Robin cut up the breast into 4 parts and had each of them eat the parts. The way he saw it, that was the way to gain even stronger satanic powers. And the young men around him clearly believed that, something that's evident in Thomas Cocorales' statement to the police later on when, after being asked why he engaged in cannibalism so readily, he replied that it was Robin's desire to make them stronger, and so because of that, quote, "you just have to do it." It was even explained to investigators that the ringleader had been able to justify the whole thing by pointing to a passage in the Satanic Bible, the 7th of 9 Satanic Sacraments, which stated that man is just another animal, and so consuming its flesh was no different than eating chicken or pork. But while they may have come to accept that was a normal part of what they were doing, the authorities certainly wouldn't think a mutilated corpse was anything ordinary. And that's why, once the body of Linda Sutton was discovered just over a week later on June 1st, they treated the situation very seriously. Her body was discovered when both a maid and a manager at the Brer Rabbit Hotel found the corpse that afternoon after noticing a foul odor which began in the morning and got worse and worse as the day went on. Immediately after falling upon that discovery, they called the authorities and explained the situation. Soon after, 3 detectives arrived at the scene and started investigating, with them quickly being able to ascertain that it had been a murder. The way they came to that conclusion was, despite the advanced decomposition of the body, there was still evidence that she'd been bound by handcuffs and had been gagged with a cloth. They didn't know who had killed Linda or why, but they could at least rule out robbery right there, as upon closer inspection of the body, they found a small wad of dollar bills stuffed inside her sock. Outside of that, though, it was hard to come to any conclusions as there was just not enough evidence there to tell them what might have taken place. The state of the body meant it was particularly hard to even identify who she was. Thankfully, though, after learning that the practice of rolling up money inside of socks was something local sex workers did, it made it easier to narrow down the field of potential victims. Then, the deputy coroner was able to use dental records in order to figure out the body belonged to Linda Sutton. Of course, that wouldn't be the only thing that was learned during the coroner's autopsy, though, as, perhaps surprisingly given the composition of the corpse, he also discovered the young mother of 2 had only been dead for 3 days when she was found. So how had she gotten in such a bad state so quickly then? Well, it appeared the removal of her breast had left an open wound ripe for parasites to enter. And once they did, they were able to devour Linda in record time. While investigators wouldn't figure out the next fact until later down the line, it also meant that, given the fact she was taken on May 21st, the deceased must have been kept alive for around a week after the fact, making the whole thing even more chilling as it's unclear what was done to her during those final days outside of the horrors of sexual assault and dismemberment. Did some even worse fate await her at the hands of the 4 Satanists who believed they were doing the devil's bidding? It's hard to say, but then it was hard for police to figure out anything at that point in time. So with little information to go on, they couldn't even narrow down a list of suspects. And so, as the months went on, the case started to go cold. That was until it heated up again when a second murder occurred, this time on May 15, 1982, almost a full year later. That was when, after presumably choosing to lay low for a while in order to let the heat die down, Robin and his followers abducted 21-year-old Lorraine Borowski from the parking lot of the realtor's office where she worked. After they held her captive, they carried on with the same modus operandi as they had before by taking their prisoner to a secure location and sexually assaulting her, all before then using steel wire to sever her breast from her body. Once that was over, one of the attackers killed Lorraine with a hatchet and the body was driven over to a cemetery in nearby Clarendon Hills and dumped. While it would take some time, that body was eventually discovered there a full 5 months later, though during that intervening time, the killers remained hard at work. At that point, they'd chosen to go full speed ahead with what they were doing, and that was why, soon after on May 29th, they kidnapped a 30-year-old woman named Shui Mak as she was walking home from her family's restaurant at Hanover Park, a village just northwest of Villa Park. Initially, she'd been given a ride home by her brother that evening, but after having an argument with him, she decided to get out and go by foot instead. It was that decision that ended up sealing her fate because before she could make it home, she was picked up and, like the prior 2 victims, taken back to an undisclosed location where she was sexually assaulted, mutilated, and murdered. When it came to getting rid of her body, though, the Chicago Ripper crew would be a lot more careful than to just dump her in a field. That time, they went to the effort of actually burying her at a construction site. And once that was done and they felt safe in the knowledge she wasn't going to be found, they set their sights on their next target, with that being 19-year-old Angel York, someone who was taken just 2 weeks after the abduction of Shui Mak. Unlike the other victims, however, after handcuffing Angel and forcing her to slash her own breast with a large knife, the killers decided to duct tape her wound shut and let her go by throwing her out of the van. Why had they done that? That's hard to say. Perhaps they felt she wasn't the right person for some reason, or perhaps they were starting to have second thoughts about their actions. Whatever the reason, after escaping death by the skin of her teeth, Angel went straight to the nearest police station and reported what had happened to her. Unfortunately, though, that wouldn't lead to her kidnappers being caught quite yet, as the description she gave authorities of the men involved ultimately produced no leads. After laying low again for a couple of months, probably on account of the fear that the last victim might be able to identify them, the Chicago Ripper crew eventually returned to kill for the 4th time. But before that would happen, the police discovered the bodies of Lorraine Borowski and Shui Mak, and once they did, it quickly became apparent that they were dealing with the same person or persons responsible for the slaying of Linda Sutton a year prior. It was apparent that this was the work of the same killer since, like with Linda, each of these women had a breast removed. Interestingly, though, these weren't the only bodies that were uncovered around that time which were suspiciously similar in nature when it came to the manner of their deaths. Sure, they hadn't had their breasts removed, but the corpse of both a 35-year-old cocktail waitress and a young Hispanic woman were both later determined to have been sexually assaulted and mutilated too. On top of that, when it came to the latter victim at least, the killer had masturbated over her body once they were done murdering her, so there was reason to suspect there was some kind of connection there. That said, with only circumstantial evidence to go on when it came to linking those incidents to the other 3, in the end, investigators deemed them to be the work of a separate person. The next step was for investigators to create a psychological profile of who their killer might be. That profile said that the perpetrator was most likely a man, was local to the area, and probably had a family. On top of that, it was believed that he was almost certainly an animal lover, though there was a dark side to him that few people were aware of. Sure, it might have been a broad description, and not one which helped to narrow things down much, but it was fairly accurate, as most if not all of those qualities could be applied to Robin Gecht. But for as close as investigators got when initially trying to identify the type of person who was the ringleader behind the crimes, what they failed to realize was that he wasn't working alone. No, this was a whole crew of killers, and that crew was about to strike again as, on August 28, 1982, they kidnapped 18-year-old Sandra Delaware and, after carrying out the same sordid actions on her as they did their prior victims, they killed her and dumped her body along the banks of the Chicago River. Obviously then, when she was found by police mere hours later, she was immediately identified as the latest victim of the mystery killer, with that identification coming on account of her also having been sexually assaulted, bound, and being minus a breast. And like with Linda, Sandra was also a sex worker, something that probably made it easier for the killers to feel like they could get away with the crime, especially as the heat was already on them. Such concerns over who they killed didn't appear to extend to their next victim as, now apparently emboldened again, less than 2 weeks later they grabbed 30-year-old Rose Davis, a marketing executive who was most certainly on a higher level of the social stratosphere than their prior victims. And again, before they murdered her, they cut off her breast and took it back to their satanic chapel where they could masturbate over it and eat it. As to her body, well, that would be discovered about a week and a half later on September 8th behind a stairwell of a North Lake Shore apartment building. It was another sign that the crew were starting to get sloppy, or at the very least overconfident, as to dump a body in an out-of-the-way part of the city is one thing, but to leave it for anyone to find in a very wealthy area of Chicago, well, that's a different thing entirely. For as bold as the killers were acting, the authorities still found it difficult to narrow down any suspects. Clearly, more had to be done in terms of creating a deeper profile of who the killer was. That was why, upon discovery of Rose Davis's body, a man named Robert Ressler from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit was brought on board, with him narrowing down the profile by suggesting that the man responsible was uncertain about his sexuality and was likely bisexual. On top of that, he also claimed the perpetrator probably dressed in an effeminate fashion and may have been considered gay by some who knew him. Of course, that would only throw the investigation off more, however, as Robin Gecht was by all accounts purely heterosexual and not a man who could be described as effeminate in the way he presented himself. So, with the authorities continuing to look in all the wrong places for all the wrong people, the Chicago Ripper crew were able to carry on unperturbed and take another life on October 6th of that same year. Though that time it wouldn't be a woman they killed, rather it would be one of 2 men they fired at during a drive-by shooting, 28-year-old Rafael Tirado, a local drug dealer. It's unclear why he and his 18-year-old friend Alberto Rosario had been gunned down in cold blood by Robin and his crew. All that's known is, while driving through Chicago one day with Robin in the passenger seat, Edwin was told to slow down as his mentor had seen something he didn't like. And what he didn't like was what appeared to be a drug deal going down next to a phone booth on the sidewalk. So Robin took 2 guns from the back of the car, leaned out the window and opened fire, killing Rafael and leaving Alberto with serious injuries that he would later have to be hospitalized over. Things were getting completely out of control now, as there seemed to be no rhyme or reason for why Robin was doing anything he was doing anymore. Even the other members of his crew couldn't explain why he had randomly fired upon 2 people in the middle of the street during broad daylight. But that reckless random attitude didn't carry on to their next victim because he returned to his original MO of kidnapping a vulnerable woman. It happened later on that same day. After looking around for someone else they could abduct, the Chicago Ripper crew eventually settled on 20-year-old Beverly Washington. Her ordeal would be much the same as the women who had come before her, with her being taken off the street, then ferried over to an undisclosed location where she was tortured, sexually assaulted, and then, after her breast was cut off, left for dead near a train track. Crucially, though, she was not dead. No, perhaps in their haste to get away, or perhaps as a result of their increased overconfidence, the Chicago Ripper crew had neglected to do the job properly, and so as a result, Beverly had survived, albeit barely. That meant, when she was found by police a couple days later on December 6th, she was able to give them a detailed description of the men responsible for what had happened. It was at that point that it first truly became clear to investigators that they weren't dealing with one man, rather they were dealing with multiple, with one of them being described as a slender white male who looked to be around 25 years old, someone who was dressed in a flannel shirt and steel-toed boots and who had greasy brown hair and a mustache. More than likely, that description was referring to Thomas Kokorales, and that meant it was probably him who, once she'd been loaded into their van, ordered her to remove her clothes and perform oral sex on another man who was there. Then, after that was over, it was presumably the other man, more than likely Robin, who demanded she swallow a handful of pills he had given her, pills that quickly caused her to pass out. Of course, it wasn't just her descriptions of the culprits that proved to be invaluable for the investigation as, despite her injuries, Beverly was also able to clearly describe the vehicle they had been driving, a red van with tinted windows and feathers hanging from the rearview mirror. With more to go on now, the police were able to use that information to track down a van that matched that description a few weeks later on October 20th. Unfortunately, though, when they pulled the van over and questioned the driver, they realized he didn't match the description that Beverly had provided. No, he had red hair and no mustache, so he couldn't have been the first person she came into contact with on that fateful evening. And what's more, he didn't look like how she had described the second man who sexually assaulted her and then given her the pills either. That said, the van was a perfect match, even down to the feathers hanging from the rearview mirror. So the officer on the scene asked the driver, who had by then identified himself as Edwin Spreitzer, who the van belonged to. That was when he informed them it belonged to his boss, Robin Gecht. Now feeling like they were getting closer to finally solving the crime, the cops on scene directed Edwin to his boss's house and had him call Robin outside. When he came out to see what was going on, it became clear he matched the description of the second man. But while he must have realized how close he was to being caught once officers approached him, he didn't lose his cool. Instead, he simply acted as if nothing was wrong, as he pretended he had nothing to do with what had happened. He even offered to help with the investigation in any way he could and was only too happy to go back to the station for questioning. Of course, once he was released though, he lawyered up as quickly as possible. Something that proved to be a smart decision in the end, because after Beverly was able to identify him from a photo soon thereafter, the authority returned to his door and this time formally arrested him. And he wasn't the only person they were arresting, because Edwin would also be brought in, with the belief that he was the lone accomplice of Robin, and that, between them, the two had been responsible for not only the attempted murder and dismemberment of Beverly, but also the murder and dismemberment of Linda Sutton, Shui Mock, and Sandra Delaware. Even with the walls now beginning to close in on him, Robin wouldn't budge an inch and would continue to deny everything. Unfortunately for him, though, the same could not be said of his accomplice, as pretty quickly Edwin began to break down under questioning and told police all about what had been happening. The way he described it, not only were he and his mentor in death responsible for killing 3 women and leaving another for dead, but they were also responsible for murdering a drug dealer on the side of the road and seriously injuring his teenage friend a few months prior. Clearly both were guilty, but if one thing was becoming more and more apparent as the questioning continued, it was how scared Edwin appeared to be of the older man who was acting as his co-conspirator. It seemed like he had some kind of strange hold on him, and so it was with great trepidation that he described an additional 4 murders that were carried out with the same MO which were yet to be unearthed by investigators. In the end, though, no bodies confirming that part of Edwin's story would ever be found. And while it was no doubt horrifying to hear about the satanic practices Robin was taking part in using dismembered parts of these women after the fact, without a body there could be no official charge of murder. Still, given all that the young man had confessed to, investigators felt confident they at least had enough evidence to get a confession from the ringleader as well now. But when they went back to him and presented his newly revealed information, he remained cool in his manner and steadfast in his insistence that he had not been involved in any way. That steadfastness seemed to have some kind of an effect on Edwin as well, because after investigators returned to him and he learned of how Robin had reacted, the young man suddenly panicked and began changing his own story. The way he described it then, Robin had never murdered anyone, and it was actually a third man named Andrew Kokoralis who was the culprit, with their acts of violence being carried out in a motel room located within the city. At that point, wanting to learn more about Andrew Kokoralis, investigators went to his house and questioned him. After realizing the jig was clearly up, he didn't waste much time in confessing too. As he told it, he had been responsible for the deaths of both Rose Davis and Lorraine Borowski. And what's more, he'd also been there during the kidnap and sexual assault of Sandra Delaware, with him at one point even shoving a rock inside her mouth in order to stop her from screaming. Yes, the whole picture was starting to fall into place now, but it still wasn't over because, after questioning Andrew's brother Thomas in order to get further information, it became apparent that he was also involved as well. With that meaning there were now 4 men that the authorities knew of who were responsible for the wave of murders. Thomas would end up providing additional details about the satanic chapel Robin had constructed in his attic, the very place where their ritual of masturbating over and eating their victims' dissected breasts took place. It was also him who provided further insight into why that had been done, because Robin felt it was providing him with supernatural powers. Thomas even claimed to have at one point seen no less than 15 breasts in a box in the attic, suggesting there were far more victims out there than the authorities had initially thought. So it should come as little surprise that all four would be formally charged on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, torture, and dismemberment. And that led to a trial date initially being set for early in 1983, though that date would ultimately have to be moved back after Robin pushed for a mistrial on grounds that he was legally insane. In the end, however, the courts would have none of his attempts to get off scot-free, and so things were eventually rebooked for the slightly later date of September 20th of that year. There, the jury heard all of the evidence the prosecution had collected. Evidence that included details about both the murders and the aftermath back in the group's satanic chapel. Obviously, things weren't looking good for the accused. So, feeling like he had only one card left to play, Robin took the stand himself and argued that, while he had indeed been involved in attacking Beverly Washington specifically, he had not killed or sexually assaulted anyone. No, the way he described it, this was a situation where, like the Manson family before them, the ringleader had simply been the one instructing his minions on what to do, all without taking part in the really grisly details himself. And for that reason, while he could certainly be convicted of assault, he couldn't be convicted of a more serious crime. As it turned out, he was somewhat correct in his belief. That was because, while the jury eventually determined there was enough evidence to find him guilty of attempted murder, sexual assault, deviant sexual assault, aggravated battery, and armed violence, there simply wasn't enough to convict him of outright murder. So, for that reason, Robin got off with the relatively lenient sentence of 120 years in prison, with that meaning that, while he would likely spend the rest of his natural life behind bars, he would escape death row, even if he was the ringleader of the whole thing. Of course, even if he was going to allow him to live, the judge would make his feelings on the convicted clear when after sentencing was handed down he told him, quote, "Only a devil would do these things. An animal would not do these things. A monster would." I couldn't have said it better myself. As for the other three men, well, they'd received the full punishments they deserved for their roles in the crimes, for the most part at least. As with there being no argument over whether or not they'd done the killing, there was simply no way out. Not that that stopped them from trying, though, particularly Thomas, who early on in the proceedings attempted to block his prior confession from being admitted into the trial. Unsurprisingly, however, he lost that attempt, and so, after a short deliberation from the jury which lasted all of 3 hours, he was convicted of the sexual assault and murder of Rose Davis and was sentenced to 70 years behind bars. And the reason his sentence was so low when compared to Robin's was because, as the man who had given the police much of the information which helped them to secure their convictions, a deal was made to treat him with some degree of leniency. That same leniency would not be afforded to his brother Andrew, as he'd end up being convicted for his part in the murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping of both Rose Davis and Lorraine Borowski, with that leading to him getting a life sentence for the former and a death sentence for the latter. Sure, his lawyers would try to appeal the sentence by arguing that, at different points, their client was either capable of being rehabilitated or was suffering from schizophrenia, so was not in his right mind at the time of the crimes. But that ultimately did nothing to change the end result, as there was no pattern of behavior on his part which signified psychosis. And there was no indication that he wouldn't continue down the same path if he was ever released back out into the world. Then there was Edwin. While it initially seemed like he'd managed to escape death row and get off with the comparatively mild sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, in the end, when being prosecuted for the murder of Linda Sutton specifically, he was sentenced to death as well, despite his lawyer's claims that he was nothing more than an immature, impulsive, and simplistic young man who was being led along by a more powerful father figure that he would have done almost anything to please. Yes, while 2 of the 4 members of the Chicago Ripper crew were going to live, at least the other 2 were going to pay the full limit of the law for what they had done. And when it came to Robin, there was still some additional bad karma awaiting him, as in November of 1998, a decade and a half after he was put in prison, his sister, mother, and nephew would all tragically die in a car crash while they were on their way to visit him. Obviously then, having 3 additional innocent people die, especially a child, is nothing to be celebrated, but some felt it a bit of karmic retribution for a man who had destroyed so many other lives. On March 17, 1999, after over a decade of waiting on death row, Andrew Kokorales was finally executed by lethal injection. Andrew was flown to the Supermax prison in Tams, Illinois, and would there spend the day praying and saying his final goodbyes to his friends via telephone calls as he tried to set things right as best he could. Prior to his execution, he would even decline to have a last meal, with him perhaps feeling he didn't deserve it on account of what he had done. And that's an assumption that's further bolstered by his final words before he was killed. Quote, "To the Borowski family, I am truly sorry for your loss. I mean this sincerely. Repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." With Andrew dead and both his brother Thomas and Robin serving a life sentence behind bars, the only thing left was for Edward Spreitzer to be executed too. Or at least that's what most assumed would be the case. But in one final twist to the whole story, Robin's son David would also be found guilty of first-degree murder after shooting a man named Roberto Cruz, who he had apparently gotten into some kind of argument with. David Gecht, who was 18 at the time and so able to stand trial as an adult, was sentenced to 45 years behind bars, but was eventually exonerated along with dozens of other people who had been wrongly convicted due to the misconduct of a handful of Chicago police detectives. He was released on July 18, 2022. Not that that incident held much interest for Edwin, though, as while David was being convicted, all he was worried about was his upcoming execution. Luckily for him then, in 2011, after having continued doubts about the effectiveness of the death penalty in terms of acting as a deterrent in the state of Illinois, as well as the increased number of wrongful convictions which were associated with it, Governor George Ryan decided to offer a stay of execution to everyone who was on death row, with that meaning Edwin's sentence would be commuted to life in prison without parole instead. But that still wouldn't be the end of the story, because while Edwin remains behind bars to this day, fully aware he'll never be released, and Robin continues his stay at Danville Correctional Center, with his parole date not coming until October of 2042, at which time he'll be 88 years old, at least one member of the Chicago Ripper crew can now call themselves a free man again. That's right, in what was certainly deemed a controversial move by many, Thomas Kokorales was granted parole on March 29, 2019, on account of his good behavior while behind bars. That meant that as of June 30th of the same year, he began living at Wayside Cross Ministries in Aurora, Illinois, somewhere he remains to this day. But while you might think his time in prison had taught him to be repentful for his actions, he continues to maintain his innocence, with him claiming in an interview with WBBM-TV not long after his release that, quote, "Everybody thinks I'm a monster. I'm not a monster." Of course, those affected by his crimes aren't having any of it. No, they believe his release was nothing less than a travesty of justice. As Mark Borowski, the younger brother of Lorraine, would put it, quote, "It makes me feel sick to my stomach." And he's not the only member of the Borowski family who feels that, as Lorraine's mother, also named Lorraine, would go on record as stating, quote, "I'm afraid. I will never understand how a man who was convicted of raping and murdering my daughter could be walking free in Illinois today. My daughter was an innocent victim. Her murderer did not receive the justice that he deserved. But I believe in God, and I have no doubt that God will deliver the final judgment." Regardless of how they felt about the situation, though, Thomas is now a free man once more, without any restrictions imposed on him other than those associated with being a registered sex offender. And even if the family of at least one of his victims might feel threatened by him being out on the streets, as he has shown no signs of threatening behavior towards them, there's little that can be done to put him back behind bars. As it stands right now, it looks like he'll remain a free man from here on, providing there are no further incidents, of course. That said, regardless of his legal status, Thomas Kokorales' legacy will always be that of someone who, alongside his brother Andrew and Edwin Spreitzer, were led by a true psychopath named Robin Gecht into killing as many as 18 women during the early 80s, a horror which the city of Chicago is still feeling the after effects of to this day. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.